The morning started quietly in the hotel. The grand hall, with its polished floors and sparkling chandeliers, was already full of life, but it did not feel rushed. Guests moved slowly, some chatting softly, others reading newspapers or glancing at their phones. In the middle of it all, a young waitress moved carefully, balancing a tray of drinks. She was quiet and unassuming. People barely noticed her, even though she was constantly moving from table to table. Her uniform was simple, her shoes practical, and her hair tied back neatly. Nothing about her suggested that she would ever be the center of attention in such a grand place. She had been working there for a few years now. Every day felt much the same, with the usual tasks: serving coffee, clearing tables, offering polite smiles. She liked her work in small ways, the way the room smelled of fresh flowers and polished wood, the quiet sound of the piano in the background, and the gentle nods from regular guests. But she often wondered if there was something more to her life than serving drinks and cleaning tables. Music had always been her secret, a world she kept hidden from everyone. She had learned to play the piano when she was very young, practicing in the small living room of her childhood home. Often staying up late into the night when everyone else slept, music was her refuge, her friend, and sometimes the only way she could understand the world around her. The piano in the hotel had always fascinated her. It was a beautiful instrument, black and polished, standing proudly in the corner of the hall. But no one ever played it much, except for the occasional hired pianist, and even then, only during busy evenings. Most days, it sat silently, as though it were waiting for the right person to bring it to life. She often glanced at it while carrying trays or passing by. Sometimes she would pause for a moment, letting her fingers hover in the air as if she could play the notes in her mind. The sound of the piano had always filled her with a mix of longing and comfort, reminding her of late nights when she had played alone in her room, pouring all her emotions into each note. On this particular morning, the hall was quieter than usual. There were fewer guests, and the usual hum of conversation was muted. The sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long patterns on the floor, and the chandeliers glinted with soft reflections. She moved between the tables with her usual calmness, delivering drinks and clearing plates. But something felt different that day. A small excitement stirred inside her, though she could not yet name it. Perhaps it was the emptiness of the hall, or the way the light made the piano shine. Or maybe it was just a quiet feeling that something important was about to happen. As she placed a cup of coffee on one of the tables, she noticed a few guests glancing at her. Not in the usual polite way, but with curiosity. One man leaned slightly forward, his eyes following her as she moved. A woman smiled gently, as if sensing something about her that was not immediately visible. She tried not to notice and focused on her work, but a small part of her heart began to beat faster. There was a strange energy in the air, a tension that she could not explain. She carried on with her tasks, but each step seemed to draw her closer to the piano. It called to her in a quiet, almost pleading way. She felt a tug in her chest she could not ignore. She reached the far end of the hall where the piano stood. The black keys gleamed under the sunlight, and the wood seemed to whisper secrets of music long forgotten. She paused for a moment, setting her tray down, and ran her fingers over the edge of the piano. It felt smooth and cold beneath her touch. A shiver ran down her spine, not from fear, but from a sense of recognition. This was where she belonged, even if only for a few minutes. She closed her eyes and imagined the sound of the notes, the music spreading through the hall, touching every corner and filling the empty spaces. For a moment, she allowed herself to dream. Feeling the weight of her hidden talent pressing against the quiet walls of the hotel, the hall remained quiet, the few guests still absorbed in their own world. She could hear the soft clinking of cups and the gentle rustle of newspapers, but nothing else disturbed her thoughts. She looked around, noticing how ordinary everything seemed, how ordinary she felt. And yet, in that moment, there was a spark of something extraordinary. She took a deep breath, feeling her heart race. It was as if the piano had been waiting for her all these years, patiently holding its voice for the right hands to play it. She wanted to reach out, to press the keys, to let the music flow and see what would happen. But doubt crept in. What if she failed? What if the guests laughed or ignored her? She had never played in front of strangers, The thought of it made her stomach twist with nervousness. Still, the feeling would not go away. She set her tray down carefully and stepped closer to the piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys, hesitant but yearning. She could almost hear the music in her mind, a melody she had played countless times when no one was watching. It was simple, yet full of emotion, carrying the weight of her dreams and her fears. She closed her eyes again, letting herself imagine the sound spreading through the hall, wrapping around each guest, touching them in ways words could not. She felt a small thrill, the kind that comes before doing something bold, something that might change everything. At that moment, a few guests looked up, noticing her for the first time. Some whispered to each other, curious about why a waitress would stop near the piano and stare. A few raised eyebrows, exchanging silent guesses. She felt their eyes on her, and the nervousness returned, but it mingled with a new determination. She had spent too many years hiding her gift. She had worked too hard in private for this moment to pass without action. She would play, even if it was just a few notes. Even if she only played for herself. The sound of her fingers pressing down on the first keys was soft, almost hesitant. The notes were gentle, careful, yet they carried a purity that drew attention. The hall seemed to hold its breath, the sunlight catching the edges of the piano and glinting off the chandeliers. The few guests present paused in their activities, listening. Something unexpected was beginning. The simple act of a waitress playing the piano in an empty hall was enough to capture attention. But it was the music itself that started to change everything. The notes were familiar, yet somehow new, carrying emotion and depth beyond what anyone could anticipate as she continued to play. Her nerves melted away, replaced by focus and passion. Each key pressed became an expression of her soul, a message she had kept hidden for too long. She could feel the music filling the hall, touching the walls, the tables, and the guests in ways words could not. Even the sunlight seemed to respond, as if the room itself was leaning closer to hear. The ordinary hall was becoming a stage, and the ordinary day was transforming into something remarkable. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a musician, a storyteller, and a conduit for something beautiful that had been waiting for its moment. The guests began to notice more intently. A few stood, drawn forward by the sound. Conversations faded, replaced by silence and wonder. The music was soft at first, but it carried an undeniable presence, a weight of authenticity and feeling. She played with care, but also with confidence, letting the melodies rise and fall naturally. It was as if the piano and she were in conversation, sharing memories and emotions that could not be spoken aloud. Her hands moved fluidly, guided by experience, passion, and the quiet joy of finally expressing something long kept hidden by the time the final notes of her first small piece lingered in the air. The hall had changed. There was a hush, a moment of collective realization that something unexpected and beautiful had happened. The guests looked at her with curiosity, admiration, and surprise. She realized that this moment, this simple act of stepping forward, had already begun to transform her world. Her heart raced, not with fear anymore, but with exhilaration. She had taken a small step toward something greater. The feeling was intoxicating. As she sat there, hands resting on the keys, she felt a mix of relief and anticipation. The day had started quietly with ordinary tasks and routines, but it had shifted into something extraordinary. The piano had spoken through her, and she had listened. She smiled softly to herself, knowing that this was only the beginning. The hall was still, the guests absorbed in the moment, and she felt a quiet sense of belonging she had never experienced before. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not as a waitress, not as someone ordinary, but as a person capable of creating something truly beautiful. The hall seemed to breathe with her music. Yet she still sat quietly, hands resting lightly on the keys. She had played only a short piece, enough to test the water, but already the air felt charged, as if the room itself was waiting for her next move. She looked around, noticing the faces of the few guests who had stopped what they were doing. Some had wide eyes, uncertain of what they were seeing. Others were leaning forward, drawn closer by a curiosity that could not be ignored. Whispers floated through the room, soft and tentative like ripples on water.
Yes.
As people asked each other who this young woman was and why no one had noticed her before, the waitress felt a flutter of nervousness. She had taken a first step, and now the next one seemed far bigger. She glanced at the piano, letting her fingers hover over the keys. She thought about the years she had spent practicing in private, the nights when her family slept, and she poured herself into music alone. She thought about the small victories she had celebrated in solitude, the melodies that had once been just for her. The piano now sat in front of her like a bridge between that quiet, hidden world and the bustling hall around her. She could take it, or she could retreat. For a brief moment, doubt pressed against her chest like a weight. But the pull of possibility was stronger. A waiter carrying a tray of pastries passed by, giving her a curious glance. She smiled slightly, a polite small gesture, but her mind was elsewhere. She could feel the energy of the hall shifting, and she knew that if she wanted, she could step into it fully. She took a deep breath and began to play again. This time her confidence was steadier. The notes were soft at first, tentative, but they grew more certain with each passing moment. The melody was familiar to her, a tune she had often played to lift herself when she felt low or unsure. As the sound spread through the hall, she noticed how the guests responded. Their initial curiosity had turned into quiet attention, and some had even stopped speaking entirely. Her hands moved more freely now, gliding over the keys with a rhythm that felt natural and comforting. She felt a strange mix of calm and excitement, as if the music was guiding her rather than the other way around. She glanced at the grand chandelier above, its crystals catching the morning light, and she imagined the sound of each note bouncing through the room like sunlight. She did not know if anyone truly expected this, but she felt the weight of her own courage growing with every measure she played. The piano had become a channel, and she was ready to speak through it. As she continued, more guests turned to watch. Some had phones in hand, ready to capture the unexpected performance. Others simply observed, captivated by the blend of simplicity and emotion in her music. A few older guests exchanged quiet comments, nodding to each other with astonishment. She noticed a young child sitting at a nearby table, its eyes wide, mouth slightly open, completely still, except for the small movement of his fingers, tapping in rhythm with her melody. She smiled inwardly. Thinking about how music could reach people in ways words never could, the melody began to build, gaining strength and confidence. She allowed herself to become absorbed in it, feeling her emotions reflected in the notes she played. There was a subtle joy in the rhythm, a hint of sadness in the chords, and through it all, a sense of hope that she had never fully acknowledged before. The hall seemed to lean in closer, the air thick with anticipation. She played with deliberate care, but also with a freedom she had not felt in years. Each key pressed was a small triumph, a declaration of her presence and her talent. One of the guests, a middle-aged man in a suit, whispered to the person next to him, "Do you know her?" "She plays like a professional," comments spread, carried by soft whispers and quiet laughter, until the entire hall seemed aware that something unusual was unfolding. She did not stop or respond. She simply continued, letting the music speak for her. It was not a performance for recognition or praise. It was a moment of truth, a chance to reveal a part of herself that had been hidden for far too long. The waitress began to experiment slightly, adding small flourishes she had often tried in private. Each one felt natural, as though the piano itself was encouraging her. Her confidence grew with every note, and soon the timid curiosity of the audience shifted into genuine attention. People were no longer just observing, they were listening. The hum of conversation had disappeared entirely, replaced by the soft resonance of the piano filling the space. She felt the hall transform around her, each table, each chair, each guest becoming part of the story she was telling through music. A woman near the back of the hall shifted in her seat, eyes glistening with emotion. She clutched her purse tightly, as if trying to contain the sudden impact of the melody. Another man, leaning on a cane, straightened in his chair, the music reaching him in a way that seemed to lift his spirits. Even the staff working quietly in the background paused, trays in hand, listening in awe. The waitress noticed these reactions and glimpses, but she did not let them distract her. She was no longer playing for anyone but herself and the music that had lived inside her. For so long, the piece began to build to a gentle climax. Her fingers moved faster now, but with precision and ease. She allowed the melody to rise and fall, to echo through the hall in waves of sound that seemed almost tangible. There was a connection forming, invisible but undeniable, between her and the audience. People were leaning forward, mouths slightly open, eyes fixed on her hands as they moved over the keys. Some guests whispered to each other in amazement, but even their voices could not overpower the music. She felt herself smiling softly, not out of pride, but from the sheer joy of sharing something real and beautiful. A small applause began. Tentative and quiet at first, then growing steadily as more guests joined in. She paused for a moment, surprised by the sudden response, and then continued, letting the music speak louder than any words could. The applause encouraged her, not in the way that demanded perfection, but as a recognition of courage and authenticity. The hall, once ordinary and routine, had become alive with energy and emotion. The guests were no longer passive observers, they were participants in a shared experience that could not be easily forgotten. Her mind wandered briefly, thinking of the years she had spent hiding this part of herself. The long nights of practice, the quiet moments of doubt, the fear of being seen and judged, it all seemed to converge in that instant. And yet as she played, all of that faded away. She felt a lightness, a freedom she had never known. She realized that music was not just a skill or a hobby, it was a part of her identity, a voice that could not be silenced any longer. Each note was a declaration, a reminder that she had value, talent, and a story worth sharing as the final measures approached. She allowed the music to slow, to soften, to linger in the air like a gentle sigh. The hall remained still, each guest caught in the delicate aftermath of what they had just experienced. Even the sounds of the city outside seemed distant, as though the music had created a bubble around the room. She took a deep breath and let her fingers rest on the keys, feeling the vibrations fade and leave a quiet emptiness behind. The moment felt sacred, a pause between the ordinary and the extraordinary. When she finally looked up, the hall was alive with attention and admiration. Guests were clapping softly, some whispering in awe, others exchanging glances that spoke of surprise and wonder. She felt a rush of emotion, a mix of relief and exhilaration. She had taken a risk, a bold step into the unknown, and it had been met with appreciation rather than ridicule. The nervousness she had felt earlier was replaced by a quiet confidence, a realization that this was only the beginning of something bigger. The hall had become more than a workplace, more than a place of routine. It had become a stage, a space for possibility, and she had stepped into it fully. The hall was still buzzing with a quiet energy after her first few pieces. But the waitress did not notice the excitement. She was entirely absorbed in the piano, her hands moving over the keys as if they had a life of their own. Each note was precise and full of feeling, carrying the emotion she had stored for years into the empty spaces of the room. The air was thick with anticipation, and she could sense every pair of eyes on her. Every small movement in the crowd as they leaned in closer, trying to catch every note. She no longer felt fear. She felt alive, and the piano had become an extension of herself, a voice for emotions she had never spoken aloud. The melody she played now was more complex than before, filled with twists and turns that made the audience hold their breath. She allowed her fingers to dance over the keys, creating a rhythm that was both delicate and strong, a reflection of her inner world. Each chord carried a memory, a moment from her past, a dream she had nurtured in silence. The music became a language, telling a story that no words could capture. Some guests closed their eyes, letting the notes wash over them, feeling the emotions she poured into each measure. Others watched, fascinated, trying to understand how someone so quiet and unassuming could produce such beauty. She thought of the small apartment where she had learned to play, the nights spent practicing when no one was watching, the frustration when she made mistakes, and the satisfaction of finally mastering a difficult piece. She remembered the encouragement she had given herself in silence, telling herself to keep going, to believe in her own talent. All of it led to this moment, and she could feel the years of preparation flowing through her hands. She did not play for the applause or the recognition. She played because it was who she was. The piano allowed her to speak without words, to share a part of herself she had kept hidden for too long. The audience was captivated. The hall, which had seemed ordinary just moments ago, had transformed into a sanctuary of music. Some guests were whispering to each other, trying to make sense of the unexpected performance. Others were completely silent, lost in the sound of the piano. She noticed a young couple holding hands tightly, their faces soft with emotion. A group of older guests nodded subtly to each other, their eyes glistening with tears. Even the staff in the background, usually busy with their duties, had stopped to listen, mesmerized by the music. The atmosphere was no longer casual. It had become sacred, a shared experience that could not be forgotten. The melody shifted, becoming softer, more introspective. She played slowly, letting each note linger, giving it space to resonate in the room. It was a moment of reflection, pause in the flow of emotion that allowed the audience to breathe and absorb the depth of what they were hearing. She felt her own heartbeat align with the rhythm of the music, a connection between herself and the instrument that felt almost spiritual. Every movement of her fingers was intentional, every pause deliberate, as if she were shaping not just the sound, but the feeling of the entire hall. A young boy near the front of the hall watched her intently, his eyes wide with wonder. He had never seen anyone play the piano like this before, and he could feel the emotions in the music without fully understanding why. He tapped his foot softly in time with the rhythm, completely absorbed. A woman nearby leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. She whispered to herself, amazed at the depth of feeling conveyed by someone so young and seemingly ordinary. The waitress noticed these reactions and glimpses, but she did not let them distract her. She was lost in the music, and the hall was lost with her. The melody began to rise again, gaining strength and intensity. She allowed herself to play with passion, letting the notes flow freely, expressing everything she had kept inside. The music was no longer just a performance. It was a revelation. Each chord was a message, each scale a story. The audience could feel the courage it took for her to step forward. The years of practice and patience and the vulnerability of sharing something so personal. There was a sense of collective awe, as if the hall itself recognized the beauty of the moment and held its breath in respect. She glanced around briefly, noticing the subtle reactions of the guests. Some had their eyes closed, lost in the sound. Others were leaning forward, captivated by her skill. A few had their mouths slightly open, amazed that someone so seemingly ordinary could produce such extraordinary music. Even the staff, who had seen her every day as a waitress, were watching with disbelief. They had never imagined this side of her, and they could feel the pride and wonder building silently in their hearts. The transformation was complete. She was no longer just a waitress, and the hall was no longer just a place of work. It had become a stage for something magical, something unexpected, something unforgettable. The music shifted again, becoming more delicate and intricate. She played with subtle nuances, tiny variations in rhythm and tone that added depth and complexity. Each note seemed to float in the air, touching every listener in a unique way. Some guests closed their eyes, feeling the music in their hearts. Others watched her hands, fascinated by the skill and precision. She allowed herself to be vulnerable, letting the piano carry her emotions fully. The audience responded instinctively, drawn in by the authenticity and power of the performance, as the piece neared its climax. She played with a sense of urgency, each note carrying a weight of emotion that could not be ignored. The hall seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the music. Guests leaned forward, some holding their breath, others shifting in their seats, completely captivated. The energy in the room was palpable, a mixture of awe, wonder, and inspiration. She could feel the connection between herself and the audience, a silent communication that transcended words. The music had become a bridge, linking her hidden world with the lives of everyone present. A few guests were moved to tears, quietly wiping their eyes as they listened. Others whispered to each other, unable to contain their amazement. She noticed a young man near the back, his hands clenched together, eyes wide with emotion. She realized that the music was reaching people in ways she had never imagined. It was not just a display of skill. It was a gift, a moment of shared humanity. She continued to play, letting the music rise and fall. Each note, a message of hope, courage, and beauty. The final notes of the piece lingered in the air, soft and gentle, like a whisper. The hall remained silent for a moment, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath, savoring the last echoes of the music. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause began. It started as a quiet, tentative sound, but quickly grew as more guests joined in. Hands clapped, feet tapped, and voices cheered softly. The applause was genuine, filled with appreciation for her courage, talent, and the emotion she had shared. She felt a rush of relief and joy, knowing that she had taken a step that would change everything. She smiled softly, letting her hands rest on the keys. The room was alive with energy, a mix of admiration, surprise, and inspiration. Guests continued to talk in hushed tones, sharing their astonishment at the unexpected performance. Some approached her, offering quiet words of praise, while others simply stood, soaking in the lingering magic of the music. She felt a sense of pride and fulfillment, not from the recognition, but from the knowledge that she had shared something real, something beautiful, something that mattered. As she sat quietly, the hall began to return to its normal rhythm, but the energy lingered. Guests resumed their conversations, but now with a sense of wonder and connection. The staff returned to their duties, but their movements were lighter, their expressions brighter. The simple act of a waitress playing the piano had created a ripple that extended beyond the notes themselves. It had touched hearts, inspired minds. It's been reminded everyone present that extraordinary moments could arise from the most unexpected places. She took a deep breath and allowed herself a moment to reflect. This was more than a performance. It was a turning point. The music had revealed a part of herself that had long been hidden, and in doing so, it had transformed the way others saw her. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a musician, a storyteller, and a person capable of inspiring those around her. The hall, once ordinary and routine, had become a place of possibility and wonder. And she had been the catalyst for that change. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, not for the work she did or the uniform she wore, but for the talent, courage, and heart she carried within her. The piano had given her a voice, and she had spoken. The hall had listened, and in doing so, it had opened a door to a future full of potential where her music could touch lives, inspire hearts, and create moments of magic. The experience left her with a quiet confidence, a sense of purpose, and the knowledge that this was only the beginning of a journey that would change her life forever. The hall had changed completely since the first note she played that morning. What was once a quiet, ordinary place filled with guests drinking coffee and talking softly had transformed into a space alive with music, emotion, and anticipation. The waitress sat at the piano, feeling the resonance of each key beneath her fingers, fully absorbed in the melody. She had stepped out of her ordinary world and into something extraordinary, and every movement of her hands confirmed that she belonged there. Each note was deliberate, yet flowing, carrying emotion and stories she had kept hidden for years. The audience was no longer passive. They leaned forward in their chairs, their attention entirely captured by her performance. Some had their eyes closed, letting the music reach them without distraction, while others watched her hands move with awe. Every gesture she made, every change in tempo or tone, created a ripple of emotion throughout the hall. She could feel the energy building, a shared connection between herself and the people around her. It was as if the music was not just filling the room, but weaving a thread that connected everyone present. She shifted her playing, adding subtle variations to the melody, gentle flourishes that demonstrated her skill without being showy. The music rose and fell, taking the audience on a journey of emotion that ranged from quiet introspection to soaring joy. She felt the power of each note, the weight of every chord, and the way it could touch hearts in ways words could not. She had never played in front of strangers before, and the realization that her music could move them so profoundly made her heart race. Yet, she remained calm, letting the piano guide her, trusting the music to speak for her. A man sitting near the front of the hall had tears in his eyes. He shifted in his chair, wiping them discreetly, unable to contain the emotions stirred by the melody. A woman across the room held her hands together, gripping them tightly as if to keep herself grounded. Even the youngest guests, children who had been fidgeting moments ago, now sat still, mesmerized by the sound that seemed to fill every corner of the hall. The waitress noticed these reactions in brief glimpses, but she did not let them distract her. She was lost in the music, and the hall was lost with her. The melody began to grow in intensity. She allowed herself to play with more passion, letting the notes rise and fall with strength and grace. Her fingers moved with confidence, creating a rhythm that was both powerful and delicate. Commanding the attention of everyone in the room, she could feel the energy of the audience feeding back into her playing. A loop of emotion and inspiration that lifted her performance higher. Every chord struck was a reflection of her own life, her hidden struggles, her dreams, and the courage it had taken to finally step into the light. The hall seemed to respond to her music. Guests who had been quietly seated now leaned forward, captivated by the beauty and emotion of the performance. A couple near the back exchanged a glance filled with awe, unable to believe the talent in front of them. An older man, who had been quietly observing, raised his hand slightly, as if to measure the impact of the sound. The staff, who had seen her every day as a waitress, now looked at her with admiration and surprise. They had never imagined that someone so ordinary in appearance could create something so extraordinary. The room itself seemed to hum with the music. The atmosphere charged with the intensity of the moment. The melody shifted, becoming softer and more introspective. She allowed each note to linger, giving the audience time to absorb the depth of her emotions. It was a gentle interlude, a pause in the flow of passion that gave the performance a sense of intimacy and vulnerability. She could feel the connection with the audience deepen, each person becoming part of the story she was telling through the piano. The music was no longer just sound. It was a conversation, unspoken language that bridged the gap between her and everyone in the hall. A young child near the front of the room looked up at her, wide-eyed, clearly moved by the performance. He tapped his fingers on the edge of the table, trying to follow the rhythm, completely absorbed in the experience. A woman seated nearby whispered softly to herself, tears brimming in her eyes, touched by the depth of emotion in the music. Even the busiest staff members had paused their tasks, listening with admiration and amazement. The hall, once ordinary, had become a shared space of wonder and inspiration. And the waitress was the center of it all. The melody began to rise once more, building in strength and complexity. She allowed herself to play with greater freedom, letting her emotions guide her hands across the keys. The music swelled, filling every corner of the hall, reaching every listener in a unique and personal way. The audience was captivated, hanging on each note, each pause, each gentle flourish. They could feel the courage it took for her to step forward, the years of practice and patience, and the vulnerability of sharing something so deeply personal. The hall had become a place of transformation. She was the catalyst. Guests began to respond, not with applause yet, but with subtle movements of admiration and awe. A few leaned forward, entranced by the intricate details of her playing. Others closed their eyes, letting the music resonate within them, feeling the emotions she poured into every chord. A middle-aged woman clutched her purse tightly, overcome by the beauty of the moment. A man near the back shook his head slightly, as if trying to comprehend the talent and bravery of the young woman before him. Even the children, who had been restless moments ago, now sat still, mesmerized by the sound that seemed to speak directly to their hearts. The melody reached its peak, a powerful surge of emotion that seemed to lift the hall itself. She played with complete abandon, her fingers moving with speed and precision, yet every note was deliberate and filled with intention. The energy in the room was palpable, a shared experience of awe, wonder, and inspiration. Guests were leaning forward, some holding their breath, others quietly crying, all captivated by the unexpected brilliance of the performance. She felt the power of the moment, the impact of her music on everyone around her, and it filled her with a sense of fulfillment and joy that she had never experienced before. As the final notes approached, she allowed the music to soften, to linger, to resonate in the hearts of the listeners. The hall was completely silent, each person caught in the delicate aftermath of what they had just experienced. It was a pause between the extraordinary and the ordinary, a moment of reflection and connection. She let her hands rest lightly on the keys, feeling the vibrations fade and leave a quiet emptiness behind. The silence was profound, almost sacred, as if the room itself was honoring the beauty of the moment. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the hall. It started softly, tentative, almost unsure, but quickly grew as more guests joined in. Hands clapped, some stomping lightly in rhythm, others giving soft cheers of admiration. The applause was genuine, filled with appreciation for her courage, talent, and the emotion she had shared. She felt a rush of relief and pride, knowing that she had taken a step that would change her life. The nervousness that had accompanied her at the beginning had completely vanished, replaced by a quiet confidence and a sense of accomplishment. She smiled softly. Looking around at the hall filled with people who had witnessed her talent, guests approached her, offering quiet words of praise, shaking their heads in disbelief, and sharing their admiration. The staff, who had once seen her only as a waitress, now looked at her with newfound respect. Realizing that there was far more to her than appearances suggested, the hall, which had seemed ordinary and routine just hours ago, had become a place of magic, inspiration, and transformation. And she had been the spark that ignited it. As the applause continued, she felt a sense of calm and contentment. This was more than just a performance. It was a turning point. She had revealed a part of herself that had long been hidden, and in doing so, she had touched the lives of everyone in the room. She was no longer invisible or ordinary. She was a musician, a storyteller, and a source of inspiration. The hall had been transformed, and so had she. For the first time, she felt truly seen, appreciated, and recognized for her talent and courage. It was a moment that would remain in her heart forever. A memory of a day when something ordinary became extraordinary. The applause had faded into a quiet hum of admiration. But the energy in the hall remained. The guests were still looking at her, some in awe, some with smiles that spoke of being deeply moved, and a few whispering to each other about the unexpected talent they had just witnessed. The waitress sat at the piano, hands resting lightly on the keys, her heart still racing from the performance. She felt a mixture of relief, joy, and disbelief. She had stepped out of her ordinary life for a moment, and in doing so, had created something extraordinary. The hall had been transformed, and so had she. She looked around at the guests, noticing the expressions on their faces. Some were still processing what had happened, while others had tears in their eyes. She could see the respect and admiration in the eyes of the staff, who had watched her every day without realizing the depth of her talent. They had seen her move quietly among the tables, serving drinks and clearing plates, never imagining the music that lived inside her. Now, they understood. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a musician, a storyteller, a person who could move hearts and inspire others without speaking a single word. A young boy approached her slowly. Clutching a small notebook, he looked up at her with wide eyes and said, "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." She smiled warmly, kneeling slightly to meet his gaze, and said, "Thank you. I'm glad it touched you." The boy's face lit up with excitement, and he ran back to his family, whispering something that made them smile. It was a small moment, but it reminded her of the power of music, how it could reach even the youngest hearts and create memories that would last a lifetime. A woman in the back, her face streaked with tears, approached quietly and said, "I can't believe you've been hiding this talent all this time. You have to share it more." The waitress nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. She had kept her music a secret for years, unsure if anyone would ever care or understand. But now, seeing the impact it had on the people around her, she realized that hiding it had been unnecessary. The piano had been her refuge, but it could also be her bridge to the world. She could share her music, her emotions, and her story with others, and it could change lives in ways she had never imagined. The manager of the hall approached, a mixture of surprise and admiration on his face. "I've never seen anything like that," he said. "You have an incredible gift. We should do something to showcase it more often." She smiled softly, feeling both pride and humility. She had not performed for recognition or reward, but the acknowledgement was meaningful. It was a confirmation that her music mattered, that it could make a difference, and that stepping forward had been the right choice. The hall, once a place of routine and monotony, had become a stage for her talent, and it was a turning point in her life. As the guests returned to their seats and resumed quiet conversations, she sat back for a moment, letting the experience sink in. The piano, which had seemed like a distant dream just hours ago, had become a part of her reality. She realized that she had taken a risk, stepping out of her comfort zone and exposing a part of herself that had been hidden for too long. And in doing so, she had not only changed her own life, but she had also touched the lives of everyone present. It was a powerful reminder that courage and authenticity could create moments of magic. Even in the most ordinary of places, the day continued, but it felt different now. The guests were more attentive, more engaged, and the atmosphere in the hall had shifted. People spoke with a new sense of wonder, sharing their thoughts and feelings about the music they had just heard. The staff moved with a lighter step, inspired by the talent they had witnessed. And the waitress, though still performing her duties, carried herself with a newfound confidence. She had discovered something essential about herself, that her voice, through music, could reach others in profound ways. She found herself thinking about the future, about the possibilities that had opened up in just a few short hours. The piano was no longer just a piece of furniture in the corner. It was a gateway to opportunities she had never imagined. She could perform more, teach others, or simply continue to share her music in ways that would inspire and uplift. The thought filled her with excitement and determination. She knew that this moment would stay with her forever, a reminder that taking a step forward, even when it felt frightening, could lead to extraordinary outcomes. As the day turned into evening, the hall gradually emptied. Guests left with smiles, some talking about the performance, and others carrying a sense of inspiration with them. The staff began to close up, but the memory of what had happened lingered in the air, like the echo of the final notes that had filled the room. The waitress stayed behind for a few moments, sitting at the piano and letting her fingers trace the keys. She did not play, but she felt the presence of the music, the connection to the people she had reached, and the sense of possibility that now existed in her life. She thought back to the moments of doubt she had felt before sitting at the piano that morning. She had worried about what others would think, about whether she was good enough, about whether her music would matter. Now all of those fears seemed distant and insignificant. She had faced them, and the result had been more than she could have imagined. She had found her voice, her courage, and her place in the world, all through the simple act of playing the piano. As she finally stood to leave, she felt a sense of peace and fulfillment. The piano would remain in the hall, waiting for the next moment, the next opportunity to create magic. But she knew that she carried that magic within herself now, wherever she went. She had discovered that greatness could exist in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the simplest actions could lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. The hall had witnessed her courage and talent, but the true transformation had happened within her. She had stepped into the light, embraced her gift, and shown the world the power of music, courage, and authenticity walking through the quiet hall. She felt a lightness in her step, a confidence she had never experienced before. The applause, the admiration, the awe of the guests, all of it, had been a reflection of the bravery she had shown in taking that first step. She realized that life was full of unexpected moments. Moments when ordinary people could do extraordinary things if they trusted themselves and their abilities, and she had done just that. She had taken a simple action, one small decision to play the piano, and it had changed everything. As she left the hall and stepped into the evening air, she felt a sense of anticipation for what was to come. Her journey was just beginning. She knew that the path ahead would be filled with opportunities, challenges, and moments of wonder. But she also knew that she was ready, that she had discovered her strength, her talent, and her voice. And no matter what happened next, she would carry the memory of that day, Day, a simple waitress, took the piano and stunned the entire halaza, a reminder of the extraordinary potential that exists within every person willing to take a courageous step forward.